The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of Le Maison d'Or, one of Silicon Valley's most prestigious restaurants. James Chen stood in front of the mirror in the staff changing room, adjusting his black bow tie for the fifth time. His hands trembled slightly. This wasn't just another day at work. It was his first day as a senior waiter at what many considered California's crown jewel of fine dining. The restaurant's interior was a testament to luxury. Crystal chandeliers hung from ornate ceilings, while hand-painted murals adorned the walls. Each table was dressed in pristine white linens, with silverware that gleamed under the perfect lighting. It was exactly the kind of place where a meal could easily cost more than a month's rent. "Remember, James," Sarah Williams, the general manager, said during the morning briefing, "we've recently been acquired by a new owner. There might be some changes coming, but for now, everything runs as usual." She paused, looking at each staff member. "And please, make sure every guest receives our signature 5-star treatment." James nodded confidently. At 32, he had spent the last decade working his way up through various high-end restaurants. He had developed what he considered a special talent, the ability to read customers. One look at their clothes, their watches, their manner of speaking, and he could tell exactly how to treat them. It was a system that had served him well, earning him impressive tips and regular compliments from wealthy patrons. Some people, he often told the newer waiters, belong in fancy restaurants. Others just want to pretend they do. Our job is to know the difference. The morning passed quickly as James familiarized himself with the menu. The chef, a stern-faced Frenchman named Pierre, had created an impressive selection of dishes that combined traditional French cuisine with modern California influences. Each dish came with its own wine pairing suggestion, and the wine cellar housed bottles worth thousands of dollars each. During the staff lunch, James sat with Marcus, another senior waiter who had been at Le Maison d'Or for 5 years. "So, any idea who bought the place?" James asked, picking at his meal. Marcus shrugged. "All we know is it's some big tech person. They're keeping it quiet for now. But honestly, these Silicon Valley types, half of them wouldn't know fine dining if it hit them in the face." He chuckled, and James joined in. They both had stories about tech workers who came in wearing hoodies and sneakers, trying to order expensive wines they couldn't pronounce. As the afternoon wore on, James practiced his new routine. He memorized the proper angle for presenting wine bottles, the correct way to describe each dish, and the exact distance to stand from the table while taking orders. Everything had to be perfect. The restaurant's reputation had been built over 20 years of impeccable service. The previous owner, an old-school restaurateur named Giovanni, had established strict protocols for everything. James was determined to uphold these standards, even if the new owner turned out to be some casual tech billionaire who didn't understand fine dining traditions. At 4:30 p.m., Sarah called another brief meeting. "Tonight's reservations include several VIP guests," she announced, her expression serious. "Remember, appearances can be deceiving. Treat everyone with equal respect." James barely concealed his smirk. He knew better. In his experience, real VIPs had a certain way about them, the way they carried themselves, their attention to detail in their appearance, their knowledge of wine and cuisine. He had developed a sixth sense for identifying truly wealthy and important guests. As the first dinner guests began arriving at 5:00 p.m., James felt completely in his element. He moved smoothly between tables, offering wine suggestions to a couple celebrating their anniversary, describing the chef's special to a group of business executives, and ensuring every detail was perfect. Little did he know that in just a few hours, his carefully constructed world of assumptions would come crashing down. The evening's most important guest, one who would change his perspective forever, hadn't arrived yet. And when he did, James would make the biggest mistake of his professional career. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the real drama was about to begin at Le Maison d'Or, where appearances would prove to be more deceiving than anyone could have imagined. The dinner service at Le Maison d'Or was in full swing when the front door opened quietly at 7:30 p.m. A man in his late 40s walked in, wearing dark jeans, a simple black sweater, and regular sneakers. His appearance was neat but remarkably casual for such an upscale restaurant. He carried no designer briefcase, wore no expensive watch, and moved with a humble demeanor that seemed out of place among the restaurant's usual clientele. At the reception desk, Lisa, a hostess, looked up from her computer with a practiced smile. The man spoke softly. "Good evening. I have a reservation for one under the name Pichai." Lisa's fingers froze over her keyboard for a moment, but her professional training kicked in immediately. She had seen the name on the VIP list, but hadn't expected such a modest presentation. "Of course, sir. Welcome to Le Maison d'Or. Please follow me." As they walked through the main dining room, several patrons glanced up briefly before returning to their meals, clearly unimpressed. James, who was serving a table of well-dressed executives, noticed the new arrival. His eyes narrowed slightly as he assessed the casual attire. "Marcus," James whispered to his colleague as they passed near the service station, "looks like we got another tech worker trying to play fancy." He shook his head disapprovingly. "Table 7 is yours, but I can take it if you're too busy with your other tables." Marcus glanced at his watch. "Actually, I have that party of 8 coming in soon. You can have it." James approached table 7, where the man had just been seated. He was reading the menu with careful attention, his fingers gently tracing the descriptions of each dish. James put on what his coworkers called his teaching voice, the tone he used for guests he believed needed guidance in fine dining. "Good evening, sir," James said, standing a bit closer than necessary. "Would you like me to explain any of our menu items?" His tone carried a slight hint of condescension. The man looked up with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "Thank you. I'm quite familiar with French cuisine, but I would love to hear about today's specials." His accent was noticeable, but his English was perfect. James, however, had already made his judgment. "Perhaps," he suggested, "you'd be interested in our Prix Fix menu. It's more." He paused meaningfully, straightforward. "Actually," the man replied, still smiling, "I'd like to start with the burgundy snails in garlic butter, followed by the duck confit. And for wine." He scanned the extensive wine list. "I'll have a bottle of the 1982 Chateau Lafite Rothschild." James couldn't hide his surprise. The wine alone cost over $4,000. "Sir," he said, his voice taking on a slightly patronizing tone, "that's one of our most premium wines. Perhaps I could suggest something more suitable." The man's expression remained unchanged, but something flickered in his eyes. "I'm quite familiar with this particular vintage. It's an excellent year." At the nearby service station, Sarah, the general manager, had been watching the interaction with growing horror. She started moving toward table 7, but was intercepted by another guest with a question. James continued his performance, speaking slowly and loudly as if addressing someone who might not understand. "The wine you selected is very expensive. Very, very expensive. Maybe I could show you our house wines?" Several nearby diners were now watching the uncomfortable scene unfold. The man in the black sweater remained remarkably composed. He folded his hands on the table and spoke quietly. "I understand the price completely. Please proceed with my order." James gave a slight shrug. "As you wish, sir. I'll need to verify the payment method first, of course. Restaurant policy for certain orders." This was not, in fact, a restaurant policy. The man reached into his pocket and placed a black American Express Centurion card on the table. The rare card, made of titanium and available only by invitation to the highest spenders, seemed to mock James's assumptions. Still, James wasn't convinced. In his mind, this had to be some sort of tech industry copycat, someone trying to play at being wealthy. He picked up the card with thinly veiled skepticism, not realizing that his next actions would lead to the most humbling experience of his career. The evening was about to take a turn that would shake the very foundation of James's carefully constructed worldview and teach him a lesson he would never forget. James's behavior toward the unassuming guest at table 7 grew increasingly inappropriate as the evening progressed. After reluctantly placing the wine order, he made a show of serving other tables first, leaving the man in the black sweater waiting far longer than necessary for his appetizer. When he finally brought the bottle of Chateau Lafite Rothschild, James's presentation was deliberately exaggerated, as if performing for someone who had never seen a proper wine service before. "Sir," he announced loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "I'll need to show you how we taste wine in fine dining establishments." The man in black simply nodded, maintaining his composed demeanor. As James went through the motions of presenting the label and uncorking the bottle, he continued his running commentary, each word dripping with condescension. "Now, when I pour a small amount, you'll want to smell it first." Do you know how to properly hold a wine glass? Several other diners looked uncomfortable, and a couple at the next table exchanged concerned glances. The man, however, calmly picked up his glass with perfect form, swirled the wine with practiced ease, and took a measured sip. "The wine is excellent," he said quietly. "Thank you." James's face twitched slightly. He hadn't expected such a professional wine tasting technique from someone he'd prejudged so thoroughly. Still, he pressed on with his assumptions, determined to prove himself right. When serving the escargot, James made a point of explaining how to use the special snail tongs and fork, speaking slowly as if to a child. "These tools might seem complicated, but just take your time. Not everyone is used to such sophisticated dining implements." The man picked up the tools and handled them with obvious familiarity, extracting and eating the snails with perfect etiquette. Yet James remained undeterred, his pride preventing him from reassessing his initial judgment. Throughout the meal, James made several trips to the service station where other staff members were gathered. "Can you believe this guy?" he whispered to Marcus. "Probably some junior programmer who just got his first bonus, trying to act like he belongs here." Sarah, the general manager, overheard these comments and tried to intervene. "James, a word please." But she was interrupted by a demanding party of 6 requiring immediate attention. She threw a worried glance toward table 7, knowing full well who was sitting there. When it came time to serve the duck confit, James outdid himself. "Now, this is a traditional French dish," he explained unnecessarily. "The duck is cooked in its own fat. That means—" "Yes, I'm familiar with the preparation method," the man interjected gently. "I've had it many times in Paris. This version looks excellent." James faltered for a moment but quickly recovered. "Oh, you've been to Paris?" His tone suggested deep skepticism. "The real Paris? In France?" "I go there quite regularly for business," the man replied, still maintaining his calm demeanor. "Usually several times a year." A young couple at a nearby table had stopped eating, openly staring at the scene unfolding before them. The woman whispered something to her partner, who shook his head in disbelief at James's behavior. As the meal progressed, James's comments became increasingly bold. When the man inquired about dessert options, James couldn't resist one more jab. "Our desserts are quite sophisticated," he said. "Nothing like what you'd find in a casual dining establishment. Perhaps you prefer a simple ice cream?" The man placed his napkin on the table and sat back slightly. "Actually," he said, his voice still perfectly controlled, but with a new note of firmness, "I would like to speak with the general manager." James smirked, assuming he was about to witness a complaint about the prices or perhaps confusion about the menu. "Of course, sir. I'll fetch her right away." He walked toward the service station, throwing a knowing look at his colleagues. What James didn't notice was Sarah's face turning pale as she watched the interaction. She had been trying to reach table 7 all evening, but the busy service had kept her occupied. Now, as she hurried toward the table, she knew the moment of truth had arrived. The revelation that was about to unfold would shake the very foundation of James's carefully constructed worldview and teach him a lesson about assumptions that he would never forget. Sarah Williams, the general manager of Le Maison d'Or, had been watching the evening unfold with increasing anxiety. Throughout her 15 years in the restaurant industry, she had never felt such a mix of horror and helplessness as she did watching James's treatment of Sundar Pichai, the restaurant's new owner and CEO of Google. She had received the confidential memo just that morning. The mysterious tech buyer who had acquired Le Maison d'Or was none other than Pichai himself. The purchase had been kept quiet to avoid media attention, and only senior management had been informed. The memo had also mentioned that Mr. Pichai planned to visit the restaurant incognito to experience the service firsthand. Throughout the evening, Sarah had tried repeatedly to reach table 7, but the restaurant was experiencing one of its busiest nights. A celebrated food critic was dining in the private room, a wedding proposal had required special arrangements, and a minor crisis in the kitchen had demanded her attention. Now, as she hurried across the dining room toward Mr. Pichai's table, her mind raced through the events she had witnessed. She had seen James's dismissive gestures, heard his condescending remarks, and noticed his deliberate delays in service. Each incident had made her cringe, but her attempts to intervene had been repeatedly thwarted by other urgent matters. "Good evening, Mr. Pichai," Sarah said softly as she reached the table, her voice trembling slightly. I'm so terribly sorry about. Sarah, please sit down for a moment. Pichai interrupted gently, gesturing to the chair across from him. His calm demeanor was in stark contrast to her obvious distress. As she took her seat, Sarah could see James watching from the service station, still wearing his smug expression, completely unaware of the situation's gravity. Around them, the restaurant continued its elegant dinner service, the soft clink of fine china and murmured conversations creating a backdrop to this unfolding drama. I've been observing more than just the service tonight, Piche began, his voice measured and thoughtful. I've been watching how different staff members interact with different types of guests. It's quite fascinating, actually. Sarah nodded, noticing how Pichai's eyes tracked the movement of servers throughout the dining room. Despite the poor treatment he received, he seemed more interested in understanding the dynamics at play than in expressing anger. Tell me, he continued, has this kind of selective service been a common practice here? Sarah felt her professional facade cracking. Mr. Pichai, I want to assure you that James's behavior tonight is completely unacceptable. He's new, and I should have. That's not what I asked, Pichai interrupted gently. I'm more interested in the culture that allows such behavior to exist. I've noticed that James treats guests differently based on their appearance, but he's not the only one. It's subtle with the others, but it's there. Sarah sat back, surprised by this observation. She had been so focused on James' obvious misconduct that she had missed the broader pattern Pichai was highlighting. From his vantage point, Pichai had spent the evening watching how servers adjusted their behavior based on guests' clothing, accents, or perceived status. While James's actions were the most extreme, there were indeed subtle variations in how different guests were treated. The interesting thing about bias, Pichai continued, taking a sip of his wine, is that it often hides in plain sight. We only notice it when it's as obvious as James's behavior tonight. But the smaller instances, the tiny adjustments in tone or attention, those can be just as damaging to a restaurant's culture. Sarah felt a mix of embarrassment and appreciation for his insight. Here was a man who, despite being treated poorly, was looking at the bigger picture and thinking about systemic improvements rather than individual punishment. Would you please ask James to join us? Pichai requested, his expression thoughtful. I think this could be a valuable learning opportunity for everyone. As Sarah stood to fetch James, she noticed Pichai straightening his simple black sweater, the very garment that had triggered James's prejudices. She realized that the evening was about to become a masterclass in leadership and humility, taught by someone who had every right to be angry, but had chosen to be instructive instead. What was about to unfold would not only change James's perspective forever, but would transform the entire culture of Le Maison d'Or. James made his way toward table 7 with the same arrogant stride he'd maintained all evening, still completely unaware of the situation's gravity. He noticed Sarah sitting with his difficult guest and assumed she was handling what he imagined to be a complaint about prices or menu confusion. You asked to see me? James said, directing his attention solely to Sarah while barely acknowledging the man in the black sweater. Please sit down, James, Sarah said, her voice carrying an unusual weight that made James pause. Something in her tone finally made him question his assumptions for the first time that evening. James, the man in the black sweater began, his voice calm and measured. I've been trying to understand something all evening. Why did you decide I didn't belong here the moment I walked in? The directness of the question caught James off guard. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly aware that this conversation wasn't going the way he'd expected. Sir, I don't know what you mean, James stammered, his usual confidence wavering. I treated you just like any other guest. Did you? The man asked, leaning forward slightly. Let's review. You suggested cheaper wines, explained basic dining etiquette I clearly didn't need, kept me waiting longer than other tables, and made several comments about tech workers trying to play rich. Would you say that's standard treatment for all guests? James felt the blood drain from his face. He hadn't realized the guest had heard that particular comment. Sarah sat silently, watching the interaction unfold. I believe, the man continued, that you made some assumptions based on my appearance. My jeans, my sweater, my ethnicity perhaps. He paused, allowing his words to sink in. But here's what interests me most. You never once considered that your assumptions might be wrong. James swallowed hard, his hands fidgeting under the table. The man's calm demeanor and articulate speech were a stark contrast to the unsophisticated tech worker James had imagined him to be. "I'm not here to embarrass you, James," the man said, his voice still gentle but firm. "But I do want you to understand something important. Success doesn't wear a uniform. Leadership doesn't always come in a suit. And wealth?" He smiled slightly. "Well, wealth often prefers comfort over show." Sarah finally spoke up, her voice quiet but clear. "James, this is Mr. Sundar Pichai, CEO of Google and Alphabet, and the new owner of Le Maison d'Or." The words hit James like a physical blow. His mind raced back through every condescending comment, every dismissive gesture, every moment of poor service he had delivered to one of the most powerful tech executives in the world, his new boss. I. James struggled to form words, his face burning with shame. "Before you apologize," Pichai raised his hand slightly, "I want you to understand something. I'm not upset about how you treated me personally. I'm concerned about how you might treat anyone who doesn't fit your image of a proper guest." The restaurant continued its elegant dinner service around them, but for James, the world had shrunk to just this table and this conversation. Every assumption he'd made, every prejudice he'd harbored, was being laid bare under the gentle but firm scrutiny of a man he had grievously underestimated. "In my journey," Pichai continued, "I've often been judged by my appearance, my accent, my name. Each time, I had a choice, to become bitter or to use it as a teaching moment. I've chosen the latter, and I'm offering you the same choice now." James sat there, his carefully constructed worldview crumbling around him. The evening had become a turning point, not just in his career, but in his understanding of human dignity and respect. "Sir," James finally managed to speak, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know what to say." "Then perhaps," Pichai replied, "it's time to listen. Would you like to hear about my first fine dining experience in Silicon Valley? It's quite relevant to our situation." As Pichai began his story, James realized he was about to receive the most important lesson of his professional life, one that would change not just how he treated guests, but how he viewed the world itself. Sundar Pichai leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped gently on the table. The ambient sounds of the restaurant seemed to fade as he began sharing his story with James, who sat rigidly in his seat, still processing the revelation of his guest's true identity. "It was about 15 years ago," Pichai began, his voice carrying a hint of nostalgia. "I had just joined Google, and despite my position, I wasn't well known then. I walked into a high-end restaurant in Palo Alto, wearing clothes quite similar to what I'm wearing now." James shifted uncomfortably, the parallel to tonight's events painfully obvious. "The waiter that evening," Pichai continued, "treated me exactly as you did tonight. He suggested the cheapest wine, spoke to me as if I were a child, and made sure I knew I didn't belong there." He paused, taking a sip of his wine. But there was another waiter, an older gentleman named Robert, who noticed what was happening. Sarah and James listened intently as Pichai's story unfolded. Around them, the restaurant continued its elegant dance of service, unaware of the profound moment taking place at table 7. "Robert took over my table. He treated me with the same respect he showed every guest. He recommended dishes based on my preferences, not my appearance. He engaged me in genuine conversation about food and wine." Pichai's eyes focused directly on James. "That night taught me two important lessons. First, that dignity should never be tied to appearance, and second, that one person's kindness can overcome another's prejudice." James felt his throat tighten. "What happened to the first waiter?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "He went on to own 3 successful restaurants." Pichai replied with a slight smile. "Robert's intervention that night changed his perspective, much like I hope this evening might change yours." Sarah, who had remained quiet during the story, finally spoke. "Mr. Pichai, I want to apologize again for—" "No need for apologies," Pichai interrupted gently. "What we need is action. James," he turned to face the waiter directly, "do you know why I bought this restaurant?" James shook his head, still struggling to maintain eye contact. "I believe that fine dining isn't just about excellent food and wine. It's about creating moments of dignity and respect for every guest. When I experienced poor treatment years ago, I promised myself that if I ever had the opportunity, I would help create spaces where everyone feels valued, regardless of their appearance or background. The weight of these words settled over the table. James thought about all the guests he had judged over the years, all the assumptions he had made, all the opportunities for connection he had missed. "Sir," James finally found his voice, "I don't deserve a second chance." Pichai's expression softened. "Everyone deserves a chance to grow, James. The question is, what will you do with yours?" Before James could respond, a commotion near the entrance caught their attention. A group of young people in hoodies and jeans, clearly tech workers from their badges and conversation, were being quietly turned away by the host. "Your first opportunity starts now," Pichai said, nodding toward the entrance. "Why don't you go welcome those guests properly?" James stood up, straightening his jacket. For the first time that evening, he felt the full weight of what true service meant. As he walked toward the entrance, he could feel Pichai's eyes following him, watching to see if the evening's lessons had taken root. The young tech workers were already turning to leave when James reached them. "Pleased," he said, his voice carrying a new warmth and sincerity. "Welcome to Le Maison d'Or. Let me show you to our best table." From across the restaurant, Pichai watched with satisfaction as James led the group to their table, treating them with the dignity and respect that every human being deserves. The evening's difficult revelation had transformed into something powerful, a moment of genuine change. Sarah turned to Pichai, curiosity in her eyes. "You never did say who that first waiter was, the one who owned 3 restaurants." Pichai smiled mysteriously as he finished his wine. "That's a story for another evening. Right now, let's watch James begin his journey of transformation." After ensuring the young tech workers were comfortably seated, James returned to table 7, where Pichai was ready to share one final lesson. The restaurant had grown quieter as the evening progressed, creating an intimate atmosphere for what would become the most important conversation of James's career. "Sit down, James," Pichai said warmly. "I want to tell you about something that happened at Google last year." He paused as James took his seat, noticing how the waiter's formerly arrogant demeanor had been replaced by genuine attentiveness. "We had a janitor at our headquarters," Pichai began, "who worked the night shift. Every evening, he would clean the executive offices, including mine. One night, I was working late and noticed something remarkable. He treated every office with the same respect, whether it belonged to a junior manager or a senior executive." Sarah and James leaned in, sensing the importance of this story. This janitor, Mohammed, had a PhD in computer science from a university in Egypt, but his credentials weren't recognized here. Yet he never let this affect the dignity with which he performed his work. Pichai's eyes met James's directly. One day, I asked him why he took such care with every office. His answer changed how I think about service. James found himself asking, "What did he say?" He told me, "Every space I clean is a space where someone dreams, works, and hopes. My job isn't just to clean, it's to honor those dreams." Pichai smiled at the memory. "Today, Mohammed leads one of our artificial intelligence teams. Not because I felt sorry for him, but because his attitude revealed the kind of leadership we needed." The lesson wasn't lost on James. He thought about how he had judged people based on their appearance, making assumptions about their worth and their right to occupy certain spaces. "The truth is," Pichai continued, "true service isn't about determining who deserves what. It's about recognizing the inherent dignity in every person who walks through that door." He gestured around the elegant dining room. "This restaurant isn't just about food and wine. It's about creating moments where people feel valued." James felt tears welling up in his eyes. "I've been so wrong," he whispered. "All these years, I thought I was maintaining standards, but I was just feeding my own prejudices." Pichai nodded understandingly. "Recognition is the first step toward change, but now comes the harder part, transforming that understanding into action." Sarah, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Mr. Pichai, what changes would you like to see at Le Maison d'Or?" "I don't want to just change policies," Pichai replied. "I want to change perspectives. James," he turned back to the waiter, "would you be willing to help lead that change?" James looked up, surprised. "Me? But after how I behaved?" "Sometimes," Pichai said gently, "those who have learned the hardest lessons become the best teachers. Your experience tonight could help others understand why every guest deserves equal respect." The proposition hung in the air as James considered its implications. His journey from prejudice to understanding could indeed serve as a powerful example for others. I would be honored, James finally said, his voice firm with newfound purpose, that I have so much to learn. We all do, Pichai smiled. That's why I'm not just buying restaurants. I'm investing in people, in their potential to grow, to learn, to become better versions of themselves. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook. I've been taking notes all evening, not just about what went wrong, but about what we can do right. James, I'd like you to work with Sarah to develop a new training program. One that focuses not just on service techniques, but on recognizing and respecting human dignity. James sat straighter, feeling the weight of this responsibility. The evening that had started with his worst professional behavior was ending with an opportunity for redemption and growth. Remember, Pichai concluded, standing to leave, every person who walks through these doors carries their own story, their own dreams. Our job isn't to judge those stories, but to help write beautiful new chapters in them. As Pichai prepared to depart, James realized that this evening hadn't just taught him about service, it had taught him about humanity itself. The lesson would prove to be just the beginning of a remarkable transformation, not just for James, but for Le Maison d'Or as a whole. 6 months had passed since that transformative evening at Le Maison d'Or. The restaurant had undergone subtle but significant changes, with James leading many of them alongside Sarah. The physical space remained as elegant as ever, but the atmosphere had shifted to one of genuine warmth and inclusivity. On this particular evening, James stood at his familiar spot near the service station, watching the dining room with new eyes. Gone was the arrogant waiter who judged guests by their appearances. In his place stood a man transformed by humility and understanding. Table 12 needs their water refreshed, he quietly reminded a new waiter named Michael, who had been watching a young couple in casual clothes with uncertainty. Remember, every guest deserves our best service. The story of James' encounter with Sundar Pichai had become part of the restaurant's training program, though James always told it with a mix of embarrassment and gratitude. New staff members would listen intently as he shared his journey from prejudice to understanding. I was the worst example of what a server could be, he would tell them during training sessions. I thought I was upholding standards, but I was really just revealing my own biases. The restaurant's reputation had actually improved since the changes. Regular guests noticed the difference in service, and word spread about how Le Maison d'Or treated everyone with equal respect and dignity. Reservations were harder to get than ever, but the clientele had become wonderfully diverse. On this evening, James was preparing for a special event. Pichai had arranged for the restaurant to host a dinner for young tech entrepreneurs from underrepresented backgrounds. As James briefed his team, he emphasized the lessons he had learned. Tonight's guests are the future leaders of Silicon Valley, he explained to his staff. Some may arrive in suits, others in hoodies. Our job is to treat each of them with the same level of respect and care. Sarah, who had watched James's transformation with pride, joined him at the service station. Mr. Pichai is coming tonight, she mentioned casually. He wants to see how the changes have taken hold. James nodded, no longer nervous about serving the restaurant's owner. Instead, he felt grateful for the opportunity to demonstrate how much he had learned. As the evening progressed, James moved through the dining room with grace and purpose. He watched with satisfaction as his team provided impeccable service to every guest, regardless of their appearance or demeanor. When Pichai arrived, dressed in his characteristic simple attire, James greeted him with genuine warmth. "Welcome back, sir, your usual table." Pichai smiled, noting the natural respect in James's manner, so different from the forced deference of 6 months ago. "Actually," he replied, "I'd like to sit at the bar tonight. I want to observe how far we've come." Throughout the evening, Pichai watched as the restaurant operated exactly as he had envisioned. Young entrepreneurs in casual wear received the same attentive service as venture capitalists in expensive suits. The staff moved with confidence, treating each guest with equal dignity. Near the end of the night, Pichai called James over. "Do you remember what I said about Mohammed, the janitor who became an AI team leader?" James nodded. "About how every space holds someone's dreams." "Look around," Pichai gestured to the dining room. "You've helped create a space where everyone's dreams are respected. That's what true luxury is about." James felt a deep sense of pride, not in himself, but in what the restaurant had become. Thank you for not firing me that night, he said quietly, for seeing the potential for change. Pichai stood to leave, placing a hand on James's shoulder. The best leaders are those who have learned from their mistakes. Your story has helped change not just this restaurant, but every new establishment we're opening. As James watched Pichai leave, he reflected on how one evening had changed everything. The lesson he had learned about judging others had transformed not just his professional life, but his entire worldview. Later that night, as James prepared to close the restaurant, a young woman in a hoodie and jeans walked in, looking uncertain. 6 months ago, he might have turned her away. Instead, he smiled warmly and said, "Welcome to Le Maison d'Or. How may I serve you this evening?" Because now he understood. True service wasn't about judging who deserved to be there. It was about ensuring that everyone who walked through those doors felt they belonged.